The billionaire had always been someone who demanded attention. He walked into a room and even the most composed people felt the weight of his presence. His rise to power had been anything but ordinary. Born into a world of modest means, he had learned early that opportunities didn't come to those who waited. He had a mind that worked faster than anyone around him, a keen sense for numbers and a willingness to take risks that others could not even imagine. From small investments in technology startups to acquiring properties that others overlooked, he built an empire that stretched across continents. His reputation was larger than life. Stories circulated about his daring business deals, the way he negotiated with world leaders, and the quiet influence he wielded behind closed doors. Yet despite his wealth and power, he remained enigmatic. Few people truly knew him, and he preferred it that way. Publicly, he was charismatic, charming even. Privately, he was calculating, always planning his next move. There was a sharp edge to him, a constant hunger for growth and dominance that never faded. Over the years, his interests expanded beyond simple business ventures. He had a taste for politics, understanding that laws and regulations could either make him richer or strip him of everything he had worked for. He began attending high-level meetings, sometimes in luxury boardrooms, other times in government offices where the air was thick with strategy and ambition. He was learning fast that money could buy influence, but true power came from shaping decisions that affected millions. The billionaire's empire was diverse. He owned stakes in global tech companies, real estate across major cities, and even had fingers in energy projects that spanned several countries. Each asset was carefully selected not just for profit, but for the leverage it provided. He was always thinking several moves ahead, predicting market changes and positioning himself to benefit. It was a game to him, a high-stakes chessboard where every piece had meaning. Despite his immense wealth, he kept a strict schedule. Mornings began with briefings from his advisors, who reported on everything from stock trends to political developments. Meetings were filled with discussions about new opportunities, potential threats, and strategies for growth. Even when he traveled, it was with a purpose. Every trip was meticulously planned, whether it was to close a deal, attend a gala, or meet a foreign minister. There was never wasted time in his world. He had learned early on that appearances mattered. The way he dressed, the cars he drove, and the events he attended were all signals. People judged him by these symbols, and he made sure every detail communicated power and confidence. Yet there was a human side that very few saw. Late at night, when the world quieted down, he reflected on the risks he had taken, the mistakes that had almost cost him everything, and the people who had believed in him when no one else would. It was a side he kept hidden, even from those closest to him. Rumors of his influence reached far and wide. Journalists speculated about his connections. Politicians worried about his reach, and everyday people were fascinated by his life. He knew the power of perception and used it strategically. A single interview, a carefully worded statement, or even a social media post could shift opinions and markets. He was a master of the unseen hand, moving pieces in ways that left the world guessing. His relationship with governments had always been complicated. He had invested in countries with booming economies, often meeting with leaders to discuss projects. Some saw him as a visionary who brought progress and jobs. Others viewed him as a manipulative force, someone who could bend policies to suit his needs. He didn't mind the critics. He understood that power always drew attention, and attention could be used as a tool. One morning, he was reading the news when he noticed a development that caught his eye. Policies were being proposed in the United States that could significantly impact one of his largest investments. It was not just a minor concern. It could alter the financial trajectory of a project he had been nurturing for years. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest. This was the type of challenge he thrived on. Unlike many who might panic, he saw an opportunity to act decisively, to assert control before others even realized the stakes. He immediately called a series of advisors and legal experts. The conversations were intense, filled with rapid-fire analysis, projections, and potential scenarios. Every possible outcome was considered, from best case to worst case, and even the unlikely ones. He didn't just react, he anticipated. By the end of the day, a plan was emerging. It involved not just financial maneuvers, but also careful communication, influence, and a subtle form of pressure that only someone with his resources could apply. Even as he plotted his next steps, he remained calm. His demeanor was always measured, a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts in his mind. He had learned that showing emotion could be a weakness in the world he operated in. Confidence, decisiveness, and clarity were his armor. Advisors marveled at his ability to remain composed even when the stakes were astronomical. Over the following days, he began discreetly reaching out to contacts in political and business circles. Each conversation was carefully calibrated to convey influence without revealing intent. He was testing the waters, gauging reactions, and adjusting his approach. It was a delicate dance, one that required patience, skill, and nerves of steel. He understood that a single misstep could unravel years of planning. At the same time, he maintained his public persona. He attended events, met with investors, and continued to expand his empire. To outsiders, it looked like business as usual. Yet behind the scenes, the billionaire was orchestrating a complex strategy that touched every corner of his network. He was not just reacting to the world. He was shaping it, bending circumstances to align with his objectives. His ambition was relentless. While some might have been content with their achievements, he constantly sought the next challenge, the next opportunity to prove himself. It was this drive that had propelled him from modest beginnings to the heights of global power. And now, faced with a potential threat to his interests, that same drive was igniting a new plan, one that would not just protect his empire but also send a clear message. He was a force to be reckoned with. As night fell, he looked out from his office in a towering skyscraper, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. He knew that the next moves would be critical. The world watched, unaware of the quiet strategies unfolding behind closed doors. And he was ready, as always, to take control, influence outcomes, and navigate the dangerous game of wealth, power, and politics. In his mind, failure was not an option, and the world was simply a chessboard waiting for his next move. The billionaire understood more than anyone that real power was not about money alone. It was about influence, timing, and perception. Every decision, every conversation, every subtle gesture could shift the balance. And now, as he prepared for what lay ahead, he felt the familiar thrill of the challenge. The stakes were higher than ever, but he was ready. This was the beginning of a story that would test his limits, shape his legacy, and bring him face to face with forces he had long admired from a distance. Yet he was confident that, as always, he would find a way to assert his influence, protect his empire, and leave a mark that could never be ignored. The days in Washington were tense. In the Prime Minister's office, advisors moved quickly. Papers rustled and phones buzzed constantly. Policies were being discussed that would affect everything from trade to technology regulations. The Prime Minister, a man known for his direct style and strong opinions, was deeply involved in every detail. He read every report, asked probing questions, and expected quick answers. The people around him were skilled, but even they felt the pressure of decisions that could change the country's future. The government had been working on a series of reforms. Some of these changes were aimed at protecting domestic industries, while others focused on new regulations for foreign investments. Everyone understood that these decisions could have ripple effects worldwide. Among the advisors, there was one constant worry. Certain policies could upset major international investors who had extensive ties to the United States. One of these investors was the billionaire, whose projects and holdings were large enough to influence not just the economy, but also public opinion. Rumors about the billionaire's discontent had already begun to spread. Some in the government had met him before and understood his power. Others had only seen him on television, where his wealth and bold statements made him seem larger than life. The tension grew when the Prime Minister considered measures that could slow down one of the billionaire's key projects. It wasn't just about money. It was about influence, global networks, and leverage. Everyone in the office could feel the weight of what was coming. The Prime Minister had a reputation for being unshaken, but he knew that international investors were not people to be underestimated. He had advisors who monitored financial news, political developments, and global relations daily. Reports showed that some investors might respond negatively to new policies. Among them, the billionaire stood out, not only for his wealth but also for his ability to act decisively. His actions could spark market shifts, affect employment, and even influence elections. Meanwhile, the billionaire was already planning. He watched the news closely, analyzing every word, every hint of a policy change, every interview that the Prime Minister gave. His team worked around the clock, producing reports and scenarios to predict how the reforms would unfold. Every small detail mattered. If the policies went through without any adjustment, it could result in significant losses for one of his largest investments. He had never been someone to ignore a threat, and this was no exception. Back in the Prime Minister's office, there were long meetings with top advisors, strategists, and policy experts. Discussions were heated at times with differing opinions on how to proceed. Some advisors pushed for a stricter approach, insisting that no foreign investor should influence domestic policies. Others argued for a careful balance, suggesting negotiations to minimize backlash. The Prime Minister listened, weighing the advice carefully, understanding that his next decisions could have far-reaching consequences. In the billionaire's world, the stakes were equally high. He did not panic, but he acted quickly. He summoned his closest advisors to a private conference. The room was filled with tension, as everyone understood the gravity of the situation. Charts were displayed on large screens showing projections, risks, and potential outcomes. The billionaire spoke clearly and decisively, outlining a plan that would protect his investments while sending a message of influence and authority. Everyone listened intently, knowing that his words were always followed by action. The billionaire decided on a multi-step approach. First, he would discreetly communicate his concerns to people connected to the Prime Minister's office. This was not a threat in the conventional sense, but a clear signal that he was watching and prepared to act if necessary. Second, he would influence public perception. He understood that shaping media narratives could pressure decision-makers without direct confrontation. Third, he would explore strategic alternatives in case the policy passed, ensuring that he would not be left vulnerable. Every move was calculated, leaving little room for error. As the days passed, the tension in Washington grew. Leaks began to surface, not directly connected to the billionaire, but creating speculation. Reporters noticed unusual patterns in market activity, investments shifting subtly, and unusual statements from industry leaders. The media buzzed with theories, and social media amplified every hint of controversy. The public, unaware of the full story, speculated endlessly. The Prime Minister's team remained vigilant, analyzing the rumors and trying to separate truth from conjecture. In private, the Prime Minister considered his options. He had advisors who warned against making decisions that could provoke a billionaire of this scale. Yet, he also had a responsibility to protect the country's interests. It was a delicate balance. He thought about meetings he had with other world leaders, the commitments he had made, and the long-term impact of policy choices. The situation required not just intelligence, but also intuition and courage. Meanwhile, the billionaire continued to operate in his controlled, deliberate way. He reached out to trusted contacts, discussing potential scenarios and assessing the Prime Minister's likely reactions. Each conversation was measured, strategic, and precise. He understood that direct confrontation could be risky, but subtle pressure combined with influence over media and business networks could be far more effective. He had done this before in different countries and situations, and his track record was impressive. The interplay between Washington and the billionaire's offices created a silent tension that was felt in both worlds. Advisors on both sides were constantly analyzing reports, projecting outcomes, and preparing for rapid developments. Every call, every email, and every media statement could tip the balance. The billionaire knew that power was not just in money, but in timing, perception, and patience. Similarly, the Prime Minister understood that decisions had consequences beyond the walls of his office. In the middle of it all, life went on for the people around them. Staffers, assistants, and junior advisors worked tirelessly, often unaware of the larger forces at play. They carried out instructions, scheduled meetings, and drafted memos, all while being part of a high-stakes environment that could change the course of careers and companies. Some understood the risks, some were caught up in the day-to-day, but all were part of a larger story that was quietly unfolding. The billionaire in particular remained calm. He avoided making rash decisions, preferring to observe patterns, anticipate moves, and stay ahead of the curve. He would watch the Prime Minister's speeches, note the reactions from advisors, and adjust his strategies accordingly. Every public statement, every financial move, every media appearance was calculated to create influence without overt confrontation. He was playing a long game, understanding that patience and precision often outweighed speed. One evening, as the city lights of Washington reflected on office windows, the billionaire reviewed his strategy with his core team. They discussed the latest developments, media coverage, and potential scenarios. He emphasized that they must remain adaptable, ready to respond to new information and maintain a low profile publicly. The plan was ambitious but necessary. He knew that any mistake could have major consequences, and he would not allow that. At the same time, the Prime Minister continued his careful consideration. He consulted advisors, reviewed economic reports, and analyzed public sentiment. He knew that international investors like the billionaire had influence, but he also believed in making decisions that served national interests. The balance between caution and assertiveness weighed heavily on him. Every choice required careful calculation, as the stakes extended far beyond immediate policy outcomes. As days turned into weeks, the tension remained high. Washington's political landscape and the billionaire's global empire seemed to move in parallel, with each influencing the other in subtle ways. Advisors on both sides worked tirelessly, anticipating reactions and preparing strategies. The world around them noticed shifts in markets and media discussions, hinting at an underlying struggle of power and influence. The billionaire understood that this was more than a business challenge. It was a test of strategy, patience, and influence. He thrived on such moments when stakes were high, decisions mattered, and the outcome was uncertain. He was not reckless but decisive. He was not emotional but human, aware of the risks and the impact of each action. In his mind, the challenge was exhilarating. A chance to demonstrate his ability to protect his empire, influence outcomes, and navigate complex political landscapes. The Prime Minister, equally aware of the pressures, prepared for the next round of decisions. He knew that advisors could offer insight, but the responsibility ultimately rested on his shoulders. Each choice carried weight, and the presence of a billionaire with global influence added a layer of complexity. He balanced strategy with intuition, relying on experience, judgment, and a sense of duty to guide his decisions. The stage was set. Two powerful forces, each with their own ambitions, perspectives, and resources, were now connected in a silent but intense confrontation. Every move, every word, every decision would matter. Washington's corridors and the billionaire's offices held quiet tension, a chessboard of influence and strategy. Neither side was unaware of the other, and both undi. The tension had reached a point where subtlety became a weapon. The billionaire understood that direct confrontation could backfire, yet he needed to send a message. Using a network of intermediaries, he began reaching out to people who had connections to the Prime Minister's office. These were not threats in a traditional sense. Instead, they were carefully phrased communications, filled with hints and warnings that the billionaire was watching and prepared to act if his interests were not considered. Every word, every tone, every pause was deliberate, designed to be noticed without provoking immediate conflict. The advisors in Washington started noticing unusual communications. Some were cryptic emails, others were off-the-record calls, and a few were subtle suggestions dropped during private meetings. The Prime Minister's team began to sense a pattern, but could not confirm the source. The atmosphere in the office became charged. Staff whispered about potential pressure from influential investors, and rumors began to circulate. Everyone knew that if the billionaire chose to intervene more openly, the consequences could be significant. Yet there was no clear evidence, only the feeling that a powerful force was maneuvering in the background. The billionaire also used media influence as part of his strategy. Articles praising his projects, interviews discussing global investments, and statements about economic opportunities were all timed carefully. They were crafted to shape perception, subtly indicating that he had both resources and reach. He understood the power of public opinion and how it could influence policymakers without direct action. This was a silent form of negotiation, using attention and visibility as leverage. In Washington, the Prime Minister and his advisors faced mounting pressure. Reports of shifting investments, market speculation, and media narratives created an invisible yet powerful force that required careful navigation. They discussed options extensively, weighing the potential risks and benefits of different responses. Some advocated for firm, unyielding policies, while others suggested finding a compromise to avoid confrontation. The debates were intense, reflecting the high stakes involved and the uncertainty of the situation. The billionaire's team worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Analysts tracked policy changes, monitored global reactions, and evaluated potential allies and opponents. Meetings often ran late into the night, filled with charts, data, and projections. The billionaire himself remained calm, observing every development, offering input, and adjusting strategies as needed. His ability to remain composed under pressure was one of his defining traits, and it allowed him to make decisions with clarity while others reacted emotionally. Despite the complexity, there was also a human element. The people working on both sides experienced stress, excitement, and fear. Some advisors felt exhilarated by the high-stakes environment, while others worried about the repercussions of every action. The billionaire's staff were intensely loyal, motivated by the challenge and the opportunity to be part of a historic struggle. In Washington, junior aides learned quickly that politics was as much about perception and timing as it was about policy. The human dimension added tension and unpredictability, reminding everyone that decisions were ultimately made by people with emotions, judgments, and biases. The billionaire also explored alternative strategies. He considered investments, partnerships, and public campaigns that could protect his interests even if policies went through unchanged. This proactive approach demonstrated his foresight and resilience. By preparing multiple scenarios, he ensured that he would not be vulnerable no matter the outcome. It was a lesson in careful planning, risk management, and the use of influence without relying solely on wealth. One evening, a subtle breakthrough occurred. A mutual acquaintance, trusted by both the billionaire and the Prime Minister's team, initiated a quiet conversation. No details were shared publicly, but it was clear that channels of communication were opening. This was exactly what the billionaire wanted, a way to send his message without escalating the situation. The Prime Minister's office, meanwhile, began to understand that influence could take many forms, and that careful observation was essential. As the days passed, the tension between visible action and subtle influence continued. The billionaire knew that patience was key. By maintaining a calm and measured approach, he could achieve his objectives without creating unnecessary risk. He understood that any misstep could be costly, and he remained focused on both short-term results and long-term consequences. Every decision was deliberate, every action purposeful. The Prime Minister, aware of the invisible pressure, continued to weigh his choices. He consulted advisors, evaluated reports, and considered the broader implications of his policies. The balance between maintaining authority and avoiding unnecessary conflict was delicate. He understood that the presence of a billionaire with global reach added a layer of complexity to every decision. Each move required careful thought, strategic foresight, and an understanding of human nature. At the same time, ordinary citizens and businesses were beginning to notice subtle shifts. Markets moved in response to rumors, investment patterns hinted at influence, and media narratives shaped public perception. While most people were unaware of the direct connection to the billionaire or the Prime Minister, the effects of their strategies rippled through society. It was a reminder that power often operates quietly, influencing outcomes without overt action. The billionaire's calm, calculated approach began to yield results. Advisors in Washington started paying closer attention to signals, reassessing the potential impact of policies, and considering ways to navigate the subtle pressure. It was an indirect form of negotiation, one that relied on perception, timing, and influence rather than direct confrontation. The billionaire understood that true power was not always about making noise. It was about shaping outcomes without the world fully realizing it. In the billionaire's office, strategy sessions became even more precise. Analysts and advisors discussed potential scenarios in meticulous detail. Each possible move by the Prime Minister's office was considered, along with likely reactions from the public, media, and international investors. The billionaire emphasized adaptability and foresight, insisting that the team remain flexible while maintaining focus on core objectives. The human element, the judgment, intuition, and reactions of all involved, was always taken into account. The Prime Minister's team, meanwhile, grew more aware of the stakes. They realized that policies could no longer be considered purely on economic or political terms. Influence, perception, and the subtle pressure from powerful investors had to be factored in. The advisors debated, strategized, and sometimes disagreed, but all understood the gravity of the situation. Every choice could ripple through markets, public opinion, and international relations. As tensions simmered, both sides maintained their daily routines, a mixture of normalcy and high-stakes strategy. The billionaire continued his public appearances, interviews, and investments, all while orchestrating a silent influence campaign. The Prime Minister continued meetings, briefings, and policy discussions, knowing that every action could be observed and analyzed by unseen forces. This dual existence, visible public life and intense private maneuvering, added to the suspense and complexity of the unfolding events. The human dimension remained central. People on both sides experienced moments of stress, excitement, doubt, and determination. They worked long hours, analyzed vast amounts of information, and made judgment calls under pressure. Their emotions, choices, and interactions shaped the narrative as much as any financial or political maneuver. The story was not just about wealth or authority. It was about human decision-making under extraordinary circumstances. As part 3 of the story unfolded, the stage was set for further escalation. The billionaire's subtle pressure had begun to influence decisions, perceptions, and strategies. The Prime Minister's team was increasingly aware that the balance of power was not entirely in their control. Both sides understood that patience, observation, and calculated moves were critical. The game was ongoing, intricate, and high stakes, with human decisions at the center of every development. The story moved forward, quietly building tension, setting the foundation for confrontation, negotiation, and the complex interplay of influence, power, and strategy. The tension between Washington and the billionaire's world had grown into something that was felt more than seen. Behind the doors of the Prime Minister's office, advisors moved like shadows, whispering ideas, analyzing reports, and constantly debating the right path. The Prime Minister himself remained calm outwardly, but inside, he understood that he was navigating a situation where every word, every gesture, and every policy could be scrutinized and influenced by someone of immense power. It was not just a policy issue anymore. It had become a game of perception, strategy, and subtle influence. Meanwhile, the billionaire's team was in constant motion. They monitored media coverage, analyzed every market reaction, and followed Washington's political chatter closely. The billionaire knew that patience was a weapon, and he wielded it carefully. His approach was not to force immediate change, but to shape decisions over time, nudging, influencing, and signaling without exposing his intentions openly. He understood that the most effective power is often invisible, moving behind the scenes to guide outcomes. Private discussions in Washington became more intense. Advisors debated whether to continue with planned reforms or adjust in response to subtle signals from the billionaire's network. Some argued that yielding would show weakness, while others warned that ignoring the situation could create unforeseen consequences. The Prime Minister had to weigh loyalty to his advisors against his responsibility to the nation and the long-term effects of his decisions. Every choice was layered with complexity, requiring not just analysis but intuition and judgment. On the billionaire's side, there was a careful orchestration of influence. He reached out indirectly to influential media personalities, business leaders, and international contacts. Each communication was measured, with the intent of signaling power without creating an outright confrontation. The subtlety was intentional. It allowed the billionaire to control perception while maintaining plausible deniability. His team documented responses meticulously, analyzing body language, tone, and timing to refine their strategy. At the same time, ordinary people were caught up in the ripple effects without knowing the full story. Markets fluctuated, investment patterns shifted, and public discourse responded to subtle cues in media coverage. It was a reminder that power often operates quietly, influencing outcomes without drawing direct attention. The human side of this story, emotions, interpretations, and judgment, was at the heart of every move. Both sides relied on human insight to gauge reactions and adapt accordingly. In Washington, the Prime Minister began to recognize the depth of the challenge. He consulted advisors repeatedly, weighing every detail and considering long-term consequences. Meetings were intense, filled with projections, possible scenarios, and discussions about potential outcomes. He listened carefully to all perspectives, understanding that even small decisions could trigger larger consequences. The delicate balance between asserting authority and navigating subtle influence required skill, patience, and judgment. The billionaire in his offices maintained an air of calm control. He was aware that the unfolding situation required both strategy and timing. Late-night discussions with his closest advisors focused on contingency plans, potential negotiations, and ways to influence without direct confrontation. He emphasized that human behavior was central to the strategy, predicting reactions, understanding motivations, and exploiting opportunities in ways that numbers alone could not explain. His approach blended psychology, strategy, and influence in a seamless manner. As the days unfolded, there were small breakthroughs. Trusted intermediaries began conversations that opened lines of communication without escalating tensions. These quiet exchanges allowed both sides to test positions, gauge reactions, and adjust approaches. The billionaire saw these interactions as progress, evidence that influence could be applied without overt pressure. In Washington, the team recognized that subtle signals were guiding decision-making, and they adjusted their strategy to account for unseen forces. The human element was always present. Advisors, staff, and analysts on both sides worked under intense pressure, navigating an environment where stakes were high and outcomes uncertain. Stress, anticipation, and judgment shaped decisions at every level. The billionaire's team remained focused, motivated by the challenge and the opportunity to protect and expand an empire. In Washington, staffers learned quickly that politics involved not just policies but also perception, timing, and strategy. These human experiences added depth and complexity to the unfolding narrative. In private moments, the Prime Minister reflected on the challenge. He understood that influence could take many forms, and that powerful individuals often operated through networks rather than direct confrontation. He balanced caution with decisiveness, recognizing that he had responsibilities to the nation and the broader public. Each choice was weighed carefully, as the consequences could extend far beyond immediate policy outcomes. It was a delicate dance between maintaining authority and responding to unseen pressure. The billionaire's approach continued to be methodical. He analyzed every reaction, refined communications, and ensured that contingency plans were in place. His strategy was not aggressive in the conventional sense. Instead, it relied on precision, observation, and the careful application of influence. He understood that a direct approach could backfire, while a patient and calculated strategy could achieve the desired outcome without creating conflict. This understanding of timing and human behavior was central to his approach. In Washington, advisors noticed patterns in the billionaire's subtle influence. They began adjusting their own strategies, considering not just the policies themselves but also the external forces shaping perceptions and potential reactions. The Prime Minister's decisions were informed by a combination of data, advice, and intuition, reflecting the complexity of navigating a situation where human judgment played a critical role. The interplay of influence and policy created a dynamic environment that required constant attention and adaptability. The ripple effects of the situation extended beyond Washington and the billionaire's offices. International investors, business leaders, and media outlets began to sense shifts in influence and power. Markets reacted to subtle signals, and public discourse reflected uncertainty and speculation. The human element, the way people interpreted events, reacted emotionally, and made judgments, was central to the unfolding story. Decisions were influenced not just by data and policy, but also by perception, relationships, and timing. As Part 4 progressed, the delicate balance between influence and authority became more pronounced. The billionaire's subtle pressure and strategic maneuvering began to shape decisions, perceptions, and outcomes without overt action. In Washington, the Prime Minister's team adapted, recognizing that power could operate quietly and indirectly. Both sides understood that patience, observation, and calculated moves were essential. Human judgment, intuition, and adaptability remained at the heart of every decision. The billionaire's calm, measured approach contrasted with the intensity of the situation. He continued to orchestrate influence carefully, guiding outcomes while maintaining discretion. His understanding of human behavior, timing, and strategy allowed him to remain effective without direct confrontation. In Washington, the Prime Minister and his advisors learned to navigate the subtle forces at play, balancing authority with responsiveness. The story, filled with tension, strategy, and human insight, continued to unfold, setting the stage for confrontation, negotiation, and the complex interplay of power and influence. The situation had reached a point where subtle signals were no longer enough. The billionaire knew that action needed to be taken to make his position clear. He had spent weeks analyzing the Prime Minister's likely reactions, monitoring advisors, and studying public opinion. He understood that a carefully executed approach could achieve his goals without creating a confrontation that would be damaging to either side. He called a private meeting with his core advisors, laying out the next phase of his strategy. Every detail was precise, every possible reaction considered, and contingency plans ready for every scenario. In Washington, the Prime Minister sensed that something significant was approaching. Advisors had warned him that powerful external forces were at play, but the billionaire's influence had been more subtle than expected. Now there were signs of deliberate pressure. Media narratives aligned in certain ways, financial moves suggested intent, and whispers from intermediaries hinted at an underlying strategy. The Prime Minister's team moved quickly, conducting briefings, analyzing reports, and discussing potential responses. The stakes were clear. The decisions in the coming days could affect not only policy outcomes but also the perception of authority and control. The billionaire began to employ a combination of indirect pressure and strategic communication. Trusted intermediaries initiated discreet conversations with contacts inside the Prime Minister's office. These communications were precise, carefully phrased, and suggestive rather than threatening. Every word was calculated to signal power and readiness without forcing an immediate confrontation. The billionaire understood the importance of timing, knowing that a well-placed signal could create more impact than overt actions. At the same time, the billionaire shaped public perception. Carefully crafted interviews, strategic statements, and selective media appearances highlighted his accomplishments, investments, and influence. Each public message was designed to demonstrate reach and credibility while leaving ambiguity about his intentions. The goal was to create awareness and subtly guide decision-making without creating a crisis that could backfire. Advisors in his team tracked reactions meticulously, analyzing public sentiment and potential responses from Washington. Inside the Prime Minister's office, tension grew. Advisors debated how to respond, weighing the potential risks of appearing weak against the consequences of confrontation. Some argued for steadfast adherence to policy, while others suggested adjustments to avoid disruption. The Prime Minister listened carefully, considering both the data and the human element, the potential reactions, emotions, and interpretations of those involved. Every choice carried weight, and the human element of judgment became as important as economic or political analysis. The billionaire also explored contingency strategies. He prepared financial safeguards, alternative investments, and diplomatic channels to ensure that, regardless of policy decisions, his interests would remain secure. This proactive approach demonstrated his understanding of risk management and foresight. He knew that even if the immediate challenge was resolved, future opportunities and threats would emerge. By preparing multiple layers of protection, he reinforced both his confidence and his influence. One key component of the strategy involved creating ambiguity. The billionaire's moves were deliberate but indirect, leaving room for interpretation. This ambiguity allowed him to test reactions, measure influence, and adjust tactics without escalating the situation. Advisors monitored responses closely, noting shifts in behavior, changes in tone, and subtle adjustments in decision-making. Every observation was documented, analyzed, and used to refine subsequent steps. The Prime Minister faced his own challenges. While he maintained public composure, the pressure behind closed doors was intense. Advisors presented analyses, risk assessments, and strategic options. He weighed loyalty to advisors, responsibility to the nation, and the potential consequences of various responses. The balance between authority and adaptability required skill, patience, and careful judgment. Every decision was scrutinized, every step measured as the invisible hand of influence became increasingly apparent. In parallel, the human element played a crucial role. Staffers, assistants, and analysts on both sides experienced stress, anticipation, and the weight of responsibility. Their judgments, interpretations, and actions contributed to the unfolding scenario. On the billionaire's side, advisors worked long hours, anticipating every possible move. In Washington, Aides and analysts processed vast amounts of information, balancing data with intuition. The human dimension added unpredictability, reminding all involved that even the most calculated plans depended on decisions made by individuals with emotions and judgment. The billionaire also sought to influence key allies indirectly. Business leaders, media personalities, and international contacts received carefully timed messages, designed to create alignment and subtle pressure. These actions were intended to create an environment where the Prime Minister's team would naturally consider adjustments without perceiving direct coercion. It was a nuanced approach that required deep understanding of relationships, influence, and human behavior. As the days progressed, interactions between intermediaries and Washington officials became more frequent. Small shifts in tone, subtle hints in conversation, and carefully placed suggestions began to create awareness of the billionaire's perspective. These interactions were measured, respectful, and indirect, ensuring that influence was felt without creating public conflict. Observers noted changes in rhetoric and adjustments in approach, even though the full extent of the strategy remained hidden. The billionaire emphasized calm observation. He avoided rash decisions and emotional reactions, focusing instead on measured influence. His team continued to monitor developments, adjust strategies, and anticipate next moves. Patience, timing, and strategic communication were the pillars of this phase. The billionaire understood that overreach could be counterproductive, while a careful, calculated approach could achieve long-term results and maintain credibility. In Washington, the Prime Minister evaluated responses and potential adjustments. He considered public perception, the impact on policy, and the reactions of advisors, media, and international observers. Decisions were made with a combination of data analysis, judgment, and intuition. The interplay between authority and responsiveness became increasingly complex, highlighting the delicate nature of navigating influence from powerful external forces. The billionaire's approach also relied on subtle signals to test the waters. Observing reactions to small controlled actions allowed him to gauge the Prime Minister's priorities, the level of sensitivity to influence, and the likely response to further steps. These observations informed subsequent moves, ensuring that every action was based on evidence, human judgment, and strategic foresight. As Part 5 progressed, the stage was set for more direct engagement. The billionaire's careful pressure had begun to shape perceptions and decision-making. Washington's team increasingly recognized that external influence could operate quietly, subtly guiding outcomes. Both sides understood that patience, observation, and careful judgment were critical. The human element, emotions, decisions, and interpretations remained central, shaping every choice and consequence. By now, both the billionaire and the Prime Minister were fully aware of the significance of the unfolding situation. The billionaire had demonstrated influence, patience, and strategic foresight. The Prime Minister had recognized the complexity of navigating external pressure while maintaining authority. The balance between power, perception, and human judgment had reached a delicate equilibrium. Both sides were preparing for the next phase, knowing that the coming interactions would be pivotal. The story had evolved from subtle signals to strategic influence, setting the stage for confrontation, negotiation, and a high-stakes interplay of authority, wealth, and human decision-making.